Hi, welcome. We're right on time here at noon, and so we're gonna jump in to a really important topic in the third session of our Parent Lunch and Learn series, Grieving Differently Even in Families. And before we start, just wanna cover a couple of things. One is just want to thank you for your participation and your feedback that you've given us that helps make these sessions even better. And we're grateful for that. So before we begin, let me just say we're only going to have 2 polls today, and I want to encourage you to have a really active conversation in the chat. Feel free. Again, if you want to come and just sort of take in the information, you are also welcome to do that. But in our initial session, I had shared that one of our hopes is to, in this online way, just to shrink a little bit of the isolation for parents who are parenting grieving kids. And so we hope that the chat, especially today, I think, and there's been a couple sessions where maybe that's not really, doesn't really fit with maybe the conversation, but today is a wonderful opportunity in the chat just to share ideas as Sophie is presenting about what's worked for your family. And I'll invite you to do that when we do the polls. As I said, there will be 2 polls just to kind of get you thinking, but also to give you an opportunity to share. And I've heard from several parents who just by seeing those polls, it allows them to feel like, hey, someone else too, or us too, and then invite you to share in the chat. So I think we'll just begin. Sophie Cook is a counselor here at the Children's Grief Center. And I've had the privilege of working with Sophie on the Lunch and Learn series. She's helped launch it. And the thing I know about Sophie that you'll get to see today is that she is thoughtful and intentional in her support of families, but also with her words. And so I know that she's really carefully crafted this content, and I trust that there will be several pieces that will resonate and equip you as you support your grieving kids. So Sophie, I'm gonna turn it over to you and let you just begin.
Wonderful. Shanna, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. It's an honor to get to speak with you all today, even just virtually speaking into the void, but glad that we're all here together and we can pass on some information. Shanna and I will be co-facilitating this topic today. Shanna will have the slides on her end, so we can hop over to the second slide, Shanna, whenever you're ready. And so this is where I'm wanting to start today with this statement that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. I know for some this might sound like a simple statement, but in many ways, and I think for many of us, it's not. But it's not as straightforward, perhaps, as this sentence would make it seem. That from wherever these beliefs come from, whether that's popular culture, whether it's from our family of origin, we get these strong messages about what it means to grieve, particularly in the context of a family. But there is this message or this sense or this belief out there that when a death occurs within the context of a family, that there will be a standard response in that family to that death. There's a sense that the members of the family will have a similar response to the death of an individual within their family. And what we know is that often isn't the case for many families. Individuals within these families have had different relationships with the person who has died. There are different personalities, different tendencies, different interests, different capacities that we do need to take into consideration in terms of how people within a family might respond differently after a death. And so it makes sense that given all the differences that families can encompass, that would continue to be the case even after a death, and that all of our responses, even within families, are different. And so we're gonna hop on there to our next slide, Shannon, unless there's anything you would add to that first slide there. All right. And so moving on to this second concept of, well, what does it mean then to all grieve differently? What differs between us when we do grieve differently within families? And so I suppose this slide can also offer a bit of an agenda as well, and kind of an overview of the things we're going to talk about and how difference can show up within families in response to grief. And so that first piece there, where difference can show up, is in the experiences of grief. So how grief shows up internally for each of us, or for each member of a family, that their internal experience of grief might differ from one another. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit throughout our presentation today. And the next piece there is around the expression of grief. So not just the internal experience and what's happening inside for us as we're navigating grief, but how we may or may not show that to others, how people may or may not be able to read that, how members in our family may or may not see our grief. And then the next piece there is remembering and looking forward. So how are the ways that we remember, and then the way we move forward and look towards the future, how is that different, and how is that the same to other members of our family? And what does it mean to have different ways of remembering? And what does that mean for there to be differences in the ways that we look towards the future? And then lastly there, we notice that there might be differences in the ways that we cope. And so we know that each individual, even within families, has different styles of coping. We have different go-tos in terms of how we go through and cope with difficult circumstance, with the death of a loved one being one of that. And so how do our differences in coping show up after the death of a loved one? And how can we work through those differences in coping to recognize and understand the way perhaps our family members are coping differently than us after a death? And is there anything you would add there, Shanna, beyond what we went over there? And so I'm wanting us to start here with the experiences and expressions of grief. And so this concept, or this framework, was developed by Martin and Doka in the early 2000s as a way to kind of conceptualize how people approach or respond to grief. That how do we differently experience and express grief? Because there isn't just one way that people universally either experience or express grief. And so before I kind of get into the explanation of this framework, I want to draw people's attention to the fact that this is a continuum, that this isn't a one or the other, we are fully in one box or fully in another box. But this really is a continuum where I believe that not only do people lay somewhere in the middle of these two, kind of in that blended section more often, but do we move through the continuum based on the day? Do we move through this continuum based on the circumstance and what it's allowing us? And so we'll speak to that a little bit later, but I really do, when we're going through this explanation today, want to draw people's attention to this concept of this being a continuum rather than two separate boxes. And so what we'll notice on the left-hand side there on the blue, you'll notice intuitive. So this type of griever, or this type of grieving, is one that is experienced more emotionally. You know, if we were to talk to someone who is grieving intuitively about what their experience of grief has been like, they're likely to use words linked with affect, linked with emotion. They'll talk about those big waves of emotion. They'll talk about the waves of affect that have been coming up for them. And so that experience of grief they'll describe as being really rooted in emotion. And when you ask someone who's grieving intuitively about their expression of grief, so how grief is coming to the surface, how maybe they're sharing that with others, they will likely talk about how their expression is mirroring their experience. So they'll be talking about those waves of emotion. Maybe they'll be naming them. You know, I felt really I felt a lot of sadness, or they'll be describing expressions of emotion. You know, I was crying, or, you know, the tears were really present, that they'll link that expression as a mirror to their experience. So that emotional experience will also be how they're expressing their grief. And then if we look on the other side, kind of on that more the right-hand side of the continuum in the green square there, we see the word instrumental. And so when we think about folks who are grieving instrumentally, these are folks who would likely use either cognitive or physical words to describe their experiences of grief. And so, you know, if you were to talk to someone who's grieving instrumentally, they would likely use cognitive language or physical language. You know, someone would say, I've been thinking about them all the time, or, you know, I keep thinking about my last day with them, or they'll say, you know, I just feel like there's a pit in my stomach, kind of that more physical experience of grief, and use probably less emotional words. And when you ask them about their expression of grief, you know, beyond kind of this internal experience, and you ask them about their expression of grief, they're more likely to maybe have trouble explaining what that expression looks like. Because I think culturally, we are less in tune with how folks who grieve instrumentally express that. So these might be folks who, you know, well, you know, I didn't actually outwardly cry that much, but, you know, I've set up a college fund, or I've set up a scholarship fund, or, you know what, I built a birdhouse that him and I had always talked about building, that they'll likely link it to more actionable items. Doka shared a story actually in one of his books about a family whose son died. He was driving home one evening and he hit a fence in the neighborhood, and he died. And so the mother and the father were grieving in two, I think, markedly different ways. You know, you would look to the mother, and she was in her home surrounded by friends who were coming and surrounding her, and they were talking about the grief, and mom was crying, and people were witnessing those tears, and she was talking about this emotional experience of what it was like for her son to have died. And one day, you know, the father walks by, and he didn't often join this circle around mom, and the father walked by, and the mom said, you know, it feels like you're not even grieving our son. Like, how are you not sitting here with us? And the son, and the father said, actually, I'm gonna go fix that fence. The dad shared, you know, I'm gonna go, you know, rebuild this fence, and I'm gonna go think about our son, and this is something that I can do, and this is my way of grieving. And so the father spoke to kind of that more instrumental type of grieving, or style of grieving. And so it was something actionable that he could undertake, whereas what the mom was needing, and the mom's way of processing, of experiencing and expressing that grief, was much more based in her emotional experience rather than instrumental, perhaps active or problem solving. And so I think something that, and that's an example, I think, that is quite juxtaposed, right? That is, it's quite obvious, but I think this can exist in more intricate ways as well, that this can show up in smaller ways, or in ways that are less noticeable. And I also think it's important for us to think about the ways where perhaps in certain circumstances, we will present as an intuitive griever. And perhaps in other circumstances, we will present as instrumental. I don't think any of us, even in the continuum, will be fixed. I do think that this is a fluid thing, and depending on the day, depending on who we're with, depending on the space provided to us and what our capacity is looking like that day, I really do think that even within that continuum, we as individuals and the members of our family will likely move throughout this continuum. And so not only is it a continuum that we all fall on somewhere, I believe that we can move throughout that continuum as well. Shan, I noticed that you unmuted, so I want to invite you to offer and to add and share.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know that these words, intuitive and instrumental, sometimes it's like, I have to reach for them, you know, and I'm really familiar. And so I love the visual of the heart and the head. And so even if you just think of it like that, sometimes there's, you know, the heart griever, the head griever, and that's still the continuum. And as Sophie said, we move given, you know, where we're showing up, who we're showing up with, what's required of us that day. And I think that when you think about families, I'm thinking of one family in particular who I work with, where so the dad has died and the mom and two kids. The mom really aligns. She finds herself quite matched with the head griever side of one of her kids. And so that one's a little bit easier to recognize the grief in that young person, in her daughter, and also to match her there, to meet her there, to have conversations from a cognitive place, from that headspace of making sense of grief and taking action around it. Those kind of things they're aligned with. But her son, who's 14, he's a bit more of a heart guy. And it actually really stands out in their family, and it makes him feel a little bit more isolated. And all of them have to learn some skills to kind of recognize where the other is at, but especially for mom, to recognize when her son, he is a heart griever. And so sometimes I just use that phrase, you know, like, right, he's the heart griever here, and he offers great gifts to your family to invite you to kind of shift over sometimes. And you offer great gifts to your family by being able to work in this more instrumental way and make space and honor that grief can also look actionable, I think you said, Sophie. So just highlighting, you don't have to remember these fancy words, intuitive or instrumental, but I think we hope that it gives you permission if you're on the instrumental side, because if you're on the doer side or the head side, because as the story about the son who died and crashed his car into the fence that Sophie shared, as that really shows, oftentimes that kind of grieving gets dismissed as not valid grief. And it is deeply valuable and brings gifts to a family as well. So I just wanted to highlight, you can let go of intuitive, instrumental, just think heart and head, and that we move.
Thank you for adding that, Shanna. I think that's so important. And again, you know, we invite conversation in the chat if people have questions, and we're also going to make time for Q&A at the end to answer any questions that folks might have coming up for them along the way. So we're going to hop to the next one here, Shanna. Thank you. So this is another framework that might be helpful in conceptualizing and understanding and making sense of the ways differences in grief show up in our families. And so the dual process model is a framework that was created to help conceptualize this adaptation that is required often of individuals and of families after someone in their life, someone in their family dies. That we see that there's kind of a dual task that is required of individuals and families after someone has died. That we see on the left hand kind of the tasks of mourning, that there's not only do we have to cope and integrate the loss, the death of this person, but we also see on the right hand side these tasks that are aligned with creating life on this side of the death, and what is that going to look like, and which is, you know, the restoration oriented. And so when we see both of these things happening in a family, and we'll go through each of these individually and kind of contextualize it within a family, but we can see in the middle there that orange line, kind of that oscillation, that bouncing between these two sets of tasks that are required of families, are required of individuals after a death. And so we see on the left-hand side this loss orientation, or this loss-oriented task, that this is really concerned with dealing with or working through aspects of the loss experience itself. And then on the other side, we see the restoration oriented tasks that are really attending to the changes that are required, the reorganizing, the re-engaging in life, and what it means to be on this side of the death. And so I think, you know, there are a lot of different examples of what this these can look like in people's lives. You know, on the loss-oriented side, for young people, sometimes this looks like, you know, talking about their special person. Sometimes this looks like wearing the clothing of their special person. Sometimes this looks like memorialization rituals. Sometimes this looks like concentration at school feeling really tough. And then on the restoration side, for young people, I think as well as for adults, this can look like an engagement in parts of our life outside of grief. So for young people, sometimes this looks like diving headfirst into extracurriculars, getting very, very involved in sports, making new friends, developing new identities, new relationships, perhaps a renewed sense of outgoingness. And so when we see these things happening, I think it's important to note that that orange line in the middle is likely different for each member of the family. The pace at which they are moving between these two sets of tasks is not going to be always aligned, is not always going to be at the same pace or at the same time. And so I think that would give us a sense even of the disconnect that is possible when some folks in the family might be, you know, more engaged with loss-oriented tasks and other folks in the family are more engaged with restoration-oriented tasks. That this could create a disconnect within the family. That, you know, if we're thinking, you know, I'm wearing their hoodie still, and I'm looking at this, I'm looking at my child, I'm looking at my teenager who is going out with their friends every night, or they are taking on another activity at school, and they're not here, they're not engaging in these memorialization rituals for me. How are we not aligning? How is this experience not the same for both of us? And so can it be an important way to conceptualize these differences, that, you know, where are we perhaps not overlapping, but also to be curious about where are the places that we are overlapping? How can perhaps we invite our children to one of these spaces? Shanna, I noticed that you unmuted as well. Did you want to kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Well, I just wanted to give an example of that. And as I'm looking at the list of the things that can bring us over, move us, the word that about the orange line is, the fancy term is oscillating, but just this movement between, as Sophie was describing, and that sometimes those are not on the same pace, they're not in the same spot at the same time. And that sometimes what I just really casually just called like a mismatch of grief in family. And I just wanted to give an example around what some of these can look like. For example, shifting continuing bonds. You see that they're on the loss-oriented side. This one can be a real source of maybe misunderstanding or conflict between family members. Part of the task, or I don't really want to use that word, but part of the journey of grief, navigating grief, is discovering how you will continue your bond with your person in their absence, in their physical absence. So the old way of thinking about grief was, you know, when a person died, the bond was cut off. That was the healthy way to do it. We moved on without them. And I think we do see it. We know it's different now. And so there is the choice and the exploration around, what do you want that to look like? And a lot of things vary. What was your relationship like with the person when they were living? And that might be different for a parent than for a child. But I wanted to give an example because around how sometimes some of these grief, loss-oriented parts, both people are still doing grieving. It just is a little bit different. I'll give an example of my own parents, what was coming to me, Sophie, as you were talking, which is my mom was a person who felt very connected to my brother when she was at the grave site. So that one's really clear that that's like a loss-oriented activity. And my dad didn't really connect to that at all. And so sometimes there was just this mismatch for them of like, do you not care? Like, are you not grieving? And so, but my dad was a basketball coach, and he had coached my brother for years. And so he found meaning, and he was grieving, and he was even loss-oriented in a thing that might look like restoration. It was kind of both, in coaching these other young men and contributing to their lives in a really active way that was still a part of his grieving. And so just highlighting an example of how sometimes it is hard to tell. And so one of the pieces around these parent sessions is you kind of are the detective for your child. And so I hope that what we're going to do in these sessions and today is give you a little bit of a lens to be doing some of that looking and some of that supporting, some of that detective work for your child.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that to today, Shen. I think that's a really important an important thing to notice. And then I think these examples so enrich, I think, our understanding of what does this look like in practice? Like, what does this look like in real lives and in reality? And I think we will have time to explore that more today. You know, things coming to mind for me is even developmentally, how different developmental phases and stages that our children are in will really impact how this looks for them, and perhaps where they find themselves more often. Personalities will impact which of these perhaps they find themselves in more often, or how quickly they move between the two. You know, and I think about, you know, older teenagers, folks who are 16, 17, 18, future-oriented restoration kind of tasks, as we can either call them or find kind of journeys, is a part of that stage of life, that it makes a lot of sense for someone at that age to be doing new things, to be thinking about the future. And so for us to take into consideration, you know, where is our child developmentally? And this will also, I think, show up later in our conversation too, when we talk about knowing our child's baseline. You know, what is typical for our child, because what we know to be true about our children and where their baseline is will give us a sense of what is out of the ordinary for them, and kind of what we can maybe come to expect from them and what we know is different. So I think that can be a piece to layer on top of this is that.
Can I add one last piece that
Please.
something you said there made me realize it's important also to add. And there's a question in the chat from Cynthia, which is kind of like, why does this matter? Why does it matter that I can identify? And I said, well, I know we're coming to that. So I've made note of that, and I know you're getting there. But as we're talking about it, you know, we'll make sure we kind of tuck that in if it's not clear. But at the end, we will definitely come back to this. But one piece I think that fits with Cynthia's question, but is important for everyone, is when you think about restoration oriented, your child's developmental stage really does matter. It will have quite a bit of impact. Obviously, as we've said throughout, we know that grief varies, that it is unique. And so these are just some general kind of principles that we're offering. And then you want to, I don't have a context around your young person. So, but what I do want to say is that for most kids, if you think about restoration oriented kind of being a bit future oriented, and one of the pieces here is that if a child is coming up to an important developmental task, that one may be impacted. So being able to move through that, it might be a little bumpier. So for example, a young person who's coming up to a major life transition, 17, 18, experiencing a recent death and grieving, may struggle, may not, back to the variation, may be able to, as Sophie said, jump right in with enthusiasm, making new relationships and having their focus on their future in that way. I've had lots of clients who are inspired and want the legacy of their person to be the work that they choose or the way that they commit to their education. And for some, that is not the way that the grief is landing for them. And it actually makes moving into the next developmental stage really, really tough. And so thinking about young people who are 17, 18, who are ready to kind of launch into adulthood, but they've just had their assumptive beliefs about the world, which is like those things we just trust without thinking about it will happen, that things will go forward, and that you will be safe, and the people you love will be safe, and that people are guaranteed a long, full life. Like, these are just some assumptions we make, and that, you know, our parents will always be here, a sibling will live a full life with us. Some of those assumptive beliefs are shattered. And so engaging in these tasks for the future are actually really, really challenging. And so you may find that they're not spending as much time over on that side as you would want or hope. So back to why this matters, being able to see where they're at, see the movement that they're doing, to be able to meet them there as parents. And also lots of parents come to us and say, are they grieving? Like, is my child grieving? Is this okay what they're doing? And so hopefully some of this information, you can say, yeah, they are. It looks different than what I'm doing. Or, oh, okay, yeah, they're struggling with that. So how can I support that? Okay, and then I do see a couple more questions. We'll come back to them. And so Sophie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Fantastic, thank you, Shanna. And that does also bring up kind of a link to our next slide, Shanna, if we're ready to move on, is if we're able to conceptualize where the members of our family are at, where our children are at in terms of instrumental or intuitive grieving, right? That heart grieving or that head grieving, you know, how they're moving through loss-oriented versus restoration-oriented, we can get a sense of where they're at and perhaps what they need from us to support them through this journey. And so we can talk a little bit about how children cope and then also how we can support them in that coping. And so when we think about, I missed the poll. Thank you, Shanna. We did want to check in with folks, and I'll let Shanna lead us through a poll here.
Just before you launch into this, because these go together, there's these three parts that Sophie's offering today, which is those kind of heady terms. It's deep and rich, but we will, when we're finished, pull up the pieces that are kind of things that you tuck away and are easy to translate into your family life. And this is one of the ways to check in and make that idea of moving between loss and restoration maybe relatable to some of the things you're already doing. So here's a poll, ways we've moved, basically. How has your family, what are some of the things? There's so many more. This list could have gone on. And this is where I would welcome you to type this in the chat. You know, I couldn't, when we put these together, we didn't cover all of the things. So ways we move between loss and restoration, you can see some there. Intentionally continuing traditions that you shared with the person who's died. Maybe you've started new ones. And you can kind of see all of those questions there. I see these are longer, so people, it takes a few minutes to read them. Having those conversations about the things that families are missing or maybe not missing, and those are okay too. Maybe just a couple more seconds. This idea of bringing the person into the present moment, talking about what they might say or think or do, and maybe their sarcasm, or they would have gotten mad, or they would have just found the funniest thing, or the silver lining, or and this last piece, I talked with my kids about how hard it is to have the shape of our family change. I know all of you know this who are on this conversation today, but you know, there's nothing to be fixed here. And just honoring that it is hard, and sometimes giving language to our kids. I think we've talked about that in these past sessions, giving language for the thing that they're experiencing, which is this is hard. I've had some clients share, I've had a couple who use the idea of like, it's like we were a four-legged table and now we're missing one of the legs of our table, and we have to kind of restructure the table so that it can hold and it's balanced. And so kind of that changing shape. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end this poll. Thanks. When these polls come up, I think I said in the first one, if you're like, oh my gosh, no, I just want to sit here, that's okay too. So this is for those of you who may want to. And if you have other ways that you've done this, type it in the chat. Okay, we'll share the results so you can see what other parents said as well. So a lot of you intentionally continuing on the traditions that you had, having that person's presence with you in that, starting some new ones, having conversations about things you miss or don't miss. So thank you for sharing. All right, there you go. Now, this other piece, Sophie, just to fit in with, back to Cynthia's question, why does this matter, and how do we do this?
Thanks, Shanna, and thanks for reminding me to get that poll in there. I would have full steam ahead there. Yeah, and so really wanting to tie in this notion of coping and, you know, why this matters, right? That if we are able to conceptualize or to understand our children's behavior as coping, will it change the way that we see that behavior? Will it change the way that we value that activity? That coping, I think, for a lot of us can look a certain way, and we have assumptions about, you know, what is coping and what is not. I think, you know, culturally, emotional sharing, I think cognitive conversations are things that are more familiar to us in terms of coping, and other ways that us as humans cope perhaps go unnoticed and unvalued. And so if we're able to notice all the way our child or children are coping, can we support them then in that? That it perhaps isn't just another activity, that perhaps this is a really active way that our child is working through this difficult moment for themselves. And so this is a concept that was created a few years back by Dr. Lahad, and it's called the basic pH model. And so this model really suggests that there are 6 central aspects that can kind of are at the core of our individual coping styles. And so if we are able to recognize, I think, not only our own tendencies, but that of those of our children, we're then able to support ourselves and our kids in accessing activities and moments and providing space where we can engage in this coping meaningfully. And so we're going to go through each of these. We're going to have a conversation about, you know, perhaps how this coping can show up. And we'll start with that first one there, so belief. So when children turn to their belief systems as a way of coping, it's really important that they have an opportunity to share those beliefs and to be around those who perhaps share similar beliefs to them. You know, we know families will reach out to faith communities and really gather around a belief system or a faith community as a way of coping. And so if we know that that's important for us, if we know that that's important for our child, how can we immerse ourselves in that? And how can we support our child in accessing that? And the next one there is affect. So really those who rely on affect for coping are counting on their ability to express their emotion and also to have their emotion witnessed by someone they trust. And for children, that is often the adults in their life who they trust. That it would be really important, you know, if affect is central to our child's coping, that we give them time, we give them opportunity, that we have organic and authentic space for them to share perhaps the emotions that are coming up for them. Emotions like anger, emotions like frustration, sorrow, maybe it's relief. Maybe there's emotions coming up that feel confusing for them. And so if emotional processing or if affect is at the core of our child's coping, how can we enhance their ability to share that and feel safe in sharing that? And the next one there is social. So folks who have socialization at the core of their coping will really benefit from a sense of connection, a reduced sense of isolation. And then for many of us, this has been a challenge through the last couple of years, is attending to that social need. And so how can we provide, if this is for ourselves, but also for our children, opportunity for genuine, authentic connection? If this is at the core of the way our child copes, how can we build that in? How can we integrate that into our parenting, into the decisions we make around how to move forward? And the next one we have there is imagination. And so imagination, this would show up as kids who cope creatively. And creativity can look like any number of things, whether it's like visual arts through crafting, whether this is painting, whether this is music, if it's imaginative play, that for those who have imagination as their primary form of coping, how can we bolster their ability to do that? Can we provide them with the resources they need to really engage in that imagination in order to cope? That for a lot of kids, that bridge between you know, our emotional internal experience, and language isn't as strongly developed as adults. And so what are other ways we can give our kids the tools to express their thoughts, express their feelings, without requiring them to use language? And often imagination is a part of that. The next one we see there is cognitive. So I think folks can probably, you know, guess what that one is, but it's really more of a problem-solving, direct coping style that, you know, I think folks would see this in older children who might really benefit from a honest, open dialogue about what's been coming up for them. And so they're able to cognitively perhaps process their emotion, and that is a way that they cope is by making sense of this, is about problem solving. That folks who have cognition as like a central coping skill might actually really respond well to strategies, that this might be something that we can provide or offer. And then the last one there is physiological. So physically, that coping is linked to body movement. So if we're able to provide our kids with the opportunity for both like formal movement as well as informal play, can that be a way for our child to cope? And I think, you know, as I said at the beginning of this slide, I think there are certain types of coping that us as individuals are more familiar with, perhaps our own are more familiar, we're more comfortable. You know, I know Shanna spoke earlier about the family who the son is more of a heart griever, whereas the mom and the daughter are more head grievers. And so when we think about perhaps what coping styles they present, it might be hard to see in our child what they're needing in terms of coping if it's not familiar to us, if it's not our default. And so knowing too that we are not just one of these things, but we probably have a go-to, and that's likely true for our child as well, that they're not stuck in one of these, but they might have a primary. Shanna, is there anything that you would add? Yeah, I see this eagerness to,
you know, I love these conversations, but I just also want to just kind of offer a couple additional pieces, which is, Cynthia, I appreciate your question at the start. And so just to keep tying it back, because these again are kind of really cognitive, heady, meaty concepts. And so let's say why this matters. Why does it matter? I think one of the important, I mean, Sophie's addressing that, but another important thing to kind of consider is it is critical and maybe or really, really beneficial to look at where the losses are in these areas too. And so, you know, I just kind of jotted a couple notes. If like, for example, affect, which is just like, I think what we would call a really emotional kid, you know, this kid's really emotional. They're gonna roller coaster. The emotions are probably gonna roller coaster. And if that's really in line with the way this child has shown up in the world with you, and you know this about your kid, then this isn't a worry. So why does this matter? This is a way to kind of answer that question that we get asked a lot. It's like, is this okay? Are they okay? A lot of parents are doing such a great job, and they really come in and like, am I doing enough? Like, are they okay? And so this is a tool that helps you kind of check in on that. How far off their baseline, their normal way of coping are they? And then where might there be losses? And so I was having a thought come to me about imagination. And if you could just also think of the word creativity in this place. I've seen a lot of times where the person who has died, whether it's a grandparent, a parent, a sibling, a good friend, if they helped the person use this way of coping, for example, I'm thinking about a couple of clients where the parent who died was really the person who facilitated their painting. So they would take them to Michael's and they would get all the supplies. It was just a thing they did together. You know, it wasn't some big intentional thing. It's just, that's how it worked out. And without the person there, it feels like a gap. It feels like even the loss of access to this way of being creative, if that makes sense. And so I think it's not only like, hey, how does my kid tend to show up in the world? It's also, you know, where were they able to do that with whom, and where might their losses be? Another on the physical side, I know it says physiological, just to use these fancy terms, but on the physical side, I was thinking, you know, like, I guess affect and physical could kind of blend a little, but if you have a kid who just shows up with a lot of physicality, you know, maybe they're fidgety, maybe they don't sit still, maybe they're so energetic, that is probably going to increase in grief, right? Those ways that their nervous systems are wired when distress is coming in, that's what we're talking about here. And so, you know, if you have a kid who's pretty physical, like lots of slamming doors, or like when their emotions are, when they are overwhelmed, these are the ways you're going to see it come out. And rather than like, hey, we're not disrespectful in this house by slamming doors. I mean, you can choose that too if you need some boundaries around that, but also recognizing it for what it is, that it's a signal in their way of coping that they are struggling. And so just kind of paying attention to that. I think that's the thing I wanted to add, like also paying attention to where the role of that person and helping them cope in those ways, and where that might be missing and where you can offer it, whether it's like creativity or some other piece. So
thank you for that addition, Shanna. No, I think that's so important. And I think what you offered as well so ties into our next slide, is about this concept of how is my child coping, right? And I think Shanna spoke to this really well actually already, and I'm noticing the time, and I'm wanting to make sure that we're able to get to the different pieces as well. So Shanna spoke to this concept, and we do invite that if anyone has questions beyond, you know, what we're able to offer today, please do reach out to us. Shanna will put our email in the chat. So if there's anything you guys are wanting to check in with us about, please do reach out. But it really is this movement from baseline, to trust, I think, that instinct in you that knows your child and knows their baseline around, you know, I know my child is a physical child, that slamming doors is something they do when they're frustrated, where they're upset, that isn't outside of the norm for them. I think to consider too that how different is their behavior getting? And I appreciate these three ideas around what is the movement from baseline like, right? What are the changes like in nature? So in the way that they're changing, and also in magnitude, so intensity, that is it a really vast difference? And then also in frequency. So how often are these changes happening? Do they come back to something that feels more familiar to who you know your child to be? Or do they come back to more familiar ways of coping that you've seen your child access before? What's feeling familiar? And I so appreciate too what Shanna offered around, you know, sometimes we just want to know, am I doing enough? Am I missing something? Is there something that my child is showing me in the ways that they're coping that tells me that they're struggling? Or is this all right? And so to consider, you know, these layers, right? We have our baseline at the center. We have, you know, behaviors that differ a little bit from what is typical for our child, quite different. And then at odds, right? That juxtaposition that this is outside of the values I know my child holds, or in who I know them to be. And so I think we can skip on to the next one, Shanna. I know we're going quickly through here, but I'm wanting to give folks time as well to ask questions. And so really to summarize and to bring this all together is this notion of, given all of these differences, given the ways that our expressions, our experiences, our tasks, and our ways of coping can be different from those in our family, how throughout all of this can we reach towards each other and spark connection or maintain connection and really foster connection with our children? And there's a lot of different things that come up here, and I'm really wanting to, you know, folks can read through what we have written on that slide there, but really wanting to think about the last two on the slide there, is that as parents, especially after a death, I think we, in a lot of ways, will take our child's lead, that they will tell us and indicate to us what they're needing and when. And I also believe we get to orchestrate moments of connection with our child, that there are moments where we will lead the dance perhaps we invite them to the dance floor, but we know the steps. And so we will invite them to the dance floor, and then we will lead the dance, that we get to orchestrate moments of connection. And so what does that look like? How do we know when our child needs us to captain the ship? And how do we know when our child needs us to follow their lead? And so we do have a poll that we're wanting to kind of get your guys' sense of that question. So how does your child or teen tell you that? Or how do you respond to their bid of hey, captain this ship?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. We'll just put that one up there. When you know, I mentioned boundaries when I talked about the slamming doors, but you know, there may be, that may be one of the ways we captain ship, is to set some boundaries or limits around what's going on for our child or our teenager when they are shifting really significantly off of their baseline, and it seems dangerous. But here's some others, you know, that you change or cancel the plans for the day. I've heard some parents say, you know, at work you get a mental health day. I give my kids a mental health day too from school. So those are some possibilities there. Being the initiator of conversations around grief, reaching out for extra supports, and planning times where it can just be fun and connecting. One last thing I wanted to add is that when we were talking about moving back and forth on that loss and restoration, distraction gets a bad rap in grief, and it's okay to have some. We can't have it living on the dining room table all of the time. And when it's there, we can welcome it, you know, and befriend it, but we don't have to always sit at the table with our grief. It's okay to create moments of distraction or orchestrate different moments of connection. So give you guys just half the people have given some feedback, and then we will make some space for some questions. I've had, you are also, if you want to privately, because you can, if you know how to do this, otherwise just maybe use your mic, but you can send me a private message. You can find my name on there and send it just to me in the chat. Maybe there's a drop down that says everyone or Shanna. And if you want me to read out your question, which we've had before, without sharing info of your family, you can do that. Okay, and then the people who wanted to respond here, majority, there's reaching out for supports and planning time. That isn't really about anything, but just having fun, connecting. Do you want this one?
Well, I'm thinking we can briefly touch on this, but I'm also, you've got like 5 minutes. Maybe I can invite people to consider the ways that love languages can show up in our parenting roles, in our guardianship roles. What are our child's love languages? How do they feel care? That I know this is language that is available in popular culture, often in the context of like romantic relationships, but I think this can apply to parenting roles as well, right? And so if we know that our child really responds to quality time, how can we do that? And you'll see there at the bottom where you can look up this graphic. If you're curious about it, there's some really wonderful writings on how love languages can show up in parenting as well. Sorry to kind of
I know.
The end here.
There's so much to get through.
And so wanting really to tie it together simply around like why this matters. And, you know, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the way that our grief is responded to matters. When we are each able in a family to not only understand each other's grief, but recognize that the grief is there, recognize the experience, the expression, the ways of coping that our family members are going through with their grief, we're likely able to respond in ways that are meaningful, in ways that are helpful, and that ultimately will help our lives grow around this grief. That if we're able to witness and honor the grief of our family members as valid, as real, in all of the ways that it shows up, then we're likely able to support each other more adequately or more fully through this. What would you add to that, Shanna? I'm wanting to open, oh goodness, we have 5 minutes.
I know, I did this on mine too. You know, there's just so much to share. I think we'll just leave it at that. And we do have one pre-submitted question. So I'm gonna move us to the Q&A here.